Happy 2024, everyone, and welcome to Story Power, episode 91. Today I'm talking with Max Friedman, who has written a book, Painful Joy, about his experiences growing up as the child of Holocaust survivors. This episode may trigger some people, so I wanted to warn you about that. But I found our conversation very compelling, and I hope you will too. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I chat about stories and creativity in all different styles and formats. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and my goal is to promote what Dale Carnegie stated in his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, instead of condemning people, let's try to understand them. Let's try to figure out why they do what they do. That's a lot more profitable and intriguing than criticism, and it breeds sympathy, tolerance, and kindness. To know all is to forgive all. It's my firm belief that the goal of most creative people is to try to understand themselves and others. That's what makes artwork of all kinds so compelling. But more than that, the personal stories of my guests promote understanding as well. Roger C. Schenck, a cognitive scientist, said, human beings are not ideally set up to understand logic. They are ideally set up to understand stories. It's my hope that Story Power will help us understand each other better by sharing the stories of my guests. Max Friedman is my guest today. So I'm really glad to talk to you again.
Yes.
About your book, Painful
Sure.
Joy, but also, are you writing anything else? So tell about Painful Joy for my Story Power listeners, because you talked about it for Patreon, but not Story Power.
Sure. Painful Joy is a Holocaust family memoir. So it's basically the story of my parents and what happened to them during the Holocaust and actually before and after. And it's a family memoir because it talks about what happens to the next generation when people are faced with the kind of trauma that the Holocaust forced on my parents. And it took 5 years to write. It was a painful joy to write and to research because I knew very little about what had happened to them and what their lives were before the war and before the Holocaust. And all I knew was that our lives were not normal. And as children and as adults, because of what they had gone through and what they lost. So this book tries to personalize an historical period that we need to remember and never to forget.
Yes.
Unless we want to make the same mistakes again.
Yes, really. So how is the book selling?
I don't really know. I think it's doing okay. I think when things first come out, it has a burst, and most people now, I think, get it in Kindle editions, and people who have Kindle Unlimited get it for free. So I think the sales are they don't sort of count, even though I think there are a lot of people who are looking at the book.
Oh, that's good.
And that's the most important thing. I didn't write this to make money. I wrote this to try to sort of restore their humanity, which they had lost, and in a sense tell my own family what had happened, and maybe they can understand why I am the way I am. God only knows.
Yes, well, you're not the only one in your family that has that kind of thing going on. Don't you have you have a sister? You told me you have a
Yeah.
sister.
Yeah, I have a sister, and she actually was a few years older. She is a few years older
Uh-huh.
than I am, and
Uh-huh.
so she was more affected by her bringing her upbringing than perhaps I was, but because I think she understood more, and she had a much harder time, I think, in just her own relationship with my mother, who
Mhm.
really was uh, quite a different person, I think, than the way she was before the war, and she
Mm.
was just traumatized to the point of serious mental illness, I think.
Oh,
Uh,
that's so sad.
and my sister got the brunt of that.
Mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm,
maybe because she was a girl, for whatever reason. Yeah, so my sister and I had to sort of become their what they call child parents
mm-hmm,
because we had to take care of our parents. My father actually probably, if you're counting numbers and the kinds of losses that these two suffered, my father, I guess, would win. He had a wife and two little girls who were murdered, and my mother had a husband. She had many brothers and their children and their spouses and her parents and hundreds of people. No one survived except for the
right.
two of them. They met after the war, after they were liberated from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and they met in Sweden where they were recuperating, and that's where my sister and I were born. And then we came to the U.S. in 1952.
Oh, wow. Uh, so you don't have any cousins, maybe, who would suffer the same kinds of.
No, no, they no. I think we did. We lived through their traumas, or as I say, we survived their survival.
Mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm,
and I think things that the way we behave sometimes, I think you could see the trauma coming out.
mm-hmm,
We're sort of subject to lots and lots of panic attacks.
mm-hmm,
When I started writing the book, I had night sweats for many months and nightmares. The nightmares that were not the same as my parents, but my parents had nightmares virtually every day. And we had to wake them up for that as little children. And so I think we are the products of their world. And we've done our best to try to overcome that and understand that. And not, I think I've completed the research for the book, and even now, as I learn more here and there, did I understand the extent of their effect on us and what happened to them.
oh my goodness. So you said when we were talking in for the Patreon thing that actually this book was helpful to your sister. Was it helpful to you too?
It was helpful to me because it was helpful to my sister. She's a lovely, wonderful person who just, as she says, is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes she's crazier than other times, and crazy in the sense of worrying, and in the
Mm,
sense of just excessively worrying, and also feeling responsibility for things that she can't possibly change. And I think the effect they had on us was that we wanted for our whole lives so far, and while they were alive, to change who they were, to
mm,
change what
oh,
they had been through, to somehow erase it, because we just saw the damage it had done to each of them, their relationship with each other, their relationship with other people, and their relationship with us, and then our what how we behaved and the worries that we had, and so she took on a great burden
mm,
that she couldn't do anything about,
mm-hmm,
and I think we're not the only children, second generation survivors, which means the children of survivors,
mm-hmm.
uh, that we all share, I think, some of that,
Mm-hmm.
because most of the people that I know who, for one reason or other, I've connected with, who were children of survivors and are children of survivors, though the survivors are all gone, pretty much,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is this silence that we felt around them, because my father never spoke about the war except for about 20 minutes
Mm-hmm.
one day when I insisted that he tell me something. So I didn't know anything about
Mm-hmm.
him or his past or his family, his first family. And
Mm-hmm.
my mother only spoke about the war within the context of concentration camps.
Mm-hmm.
So not about her life, although she made up stories about her life, which turned out were not true at all, in order to try to fantasize a life that she never managed to have. Uh, but so there's this sort of mishmash of stuff that we carry with us and that exhibits itself in weird ways and weird times. And my sister seemed to have gotten the burden of that, and um, me less so. So when I wrote the book, I would tell her all the things that I was discovering, because most of it was very surprising, and she would say great and want to get off the phone pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't really want to talk about it, and she told me just a few months ago that she never spoke about all the stories that we heard as children to her children. So they knew very little about any of this.
Oh,
Uh,
right.
I did speak to my children about what happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
And not so much about what I think, how it affected me,
Mm-hmm.
but but they knew them, and because they knew my parents. Uh, my sister lived in Mobile, Alabama, for a good part of her adult life,
Mm-hmm.
and my parents lived in Brooklyn, in New York,
Uh-huh.
and I lived nearby in Manhattan, and
Mm-hmm.
then in the suburbs of Manhattan. And so uh, she saw them less, and her kids saw her less.
Oh, right.
So they saw their grandparents less, and their kids not at all. My parents had died by then,
Mm-hmm.
so it's very different. And so I think uh, they had to learn a lot about their grandparents from my book,
Mm-hmm.
because my sister just really did not want to revisit it. And after I had written the book, I had sent her the manuscript and told her, because I knew that she was upset by what she was learning, because it was coming back. She had sort of had her hard drive erased,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then it was coming back. And so I told her that if it was after she read the book, the manuscript, and if it was too painful, I would just burn the book. It would just go away,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't want to subject her to more pain that she had already experienced. And she actually then called me and said, "No, you really have to you have to have other people read this book." And over since the book was published, which is a while ago, a number of months, she has said she's listened to my podcast and to read some interviews, and said that this has helped her heal,
Oh, good.
and that's wonderful.
Yeah. Does talking to other people who have gone through similar experiences, have you done that and does that help?
Yeah, I haven't done that very much. I again, until I decided, and this was only now 7 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
research their lives and write this book. And it was prompted, as I think we spoke about once, by a question that my grandson asked me about the nature of survival. And my grandson was 8 at the time. He's now 15. And he was having some difficulties, I guess, in some ways. And I had told him that my parents had a very difficult life, and that they were what we called survivors.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to know what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, if are survivors stronger than people who are not survivors?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because he said, then maybe I'll be a survivor one day
Mm-hmm.
and I'll be stronger. Uh, and I said, I don't know all that much about any of this. And I don't know much about the story of how they survived, what they survived. I don't even know what they lost and how they found each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, I'm going to find out. And it took me 5 years to find out and write a book about it. And as I said, I shared that manuscript with my sister, with my grandson,
Mm-hmm.
and with my wife and my two sons. So they read the book first before it was published
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to understand better their family.
Yes. Yeah. So if you had it to do over again, would you still write the book?
I'd write the book. I would have I would have been more insistent on talking to my parents about,
Mm.
because they were, I mean, there was no one around to talk to about them. All I read was testimony in various places where
Mm.
they uh, had testified about things that happened to them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I went back to archives and to where they lived, where they grew up.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't talk to people who knew them when they were in their lives back in
Right.
Poland and
Yeah.
in Germany, where they were
Yeah.
uh, imprisoned.
Yeah. Was there anybody alive to talk to even?
The only person that I actually managed to talk to, I spoke to two people
Ah.
uh, who knew them when they were young, when they had come to the United States. Nobody who knew them in Poland. The
Mm-hmm.
only person who knew them in Poland who had survived was my mother's sister, who my mother had saved in Auschwitz from being from going into the gas chambers. But we never spoke about the past. I never spoke to my aunt about the past because she had perhaps, if it's possible, a more difficult time than my mother in her survival.
Oh.
She had a daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole time that I knew my aunt, who died before my mother, she went blind and then had a stroke, I think, and died when I
Mm-hmm.
was younger, uh, was that she said she had a daughter, and the daughter was living in Sweden, and my aunt would would collect dolls for her daughter. The daughter was killed in Mauthausen. She was murdered in Mauthausen
Oh.
with my my aunt's first husband. They were both murdered. Her daughter at the time was about 11, I think, when
Oh.
she was killed. And my aunt never accepted that she had been killed.
Ah.
So my aunt spent her entire adult life in the United States uh, making believe that she had a daughter that she was going to see one day in Sweden,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
instead was remembering her daughter as a child, and therefore was collecting the dolls that she wanted to give her daughter.
Oh, yes.
So she was a nice lady, a very nice lady, but very mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear. So we never talked about anything. We would talk a little bit about her daughter, and
Mm-hmm.
I would say
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to meet her one day and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew she was gone.
Yes.
And so I didn't. I stayed away from this story because for me it was enough that I watched the story unfold for most of my life, particularly when I was young and where it affected both my sister and me the most.
Right.
And so I didn't return to that story except once or twice prior to the time I actually decided to write the book.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was too painful, maybe.
It was too painful, and I didn't know where it would get me. I didn't know what I could possibly even find, and even if I found something, what would I do with that?
Right.
And it was when basically my grandson wanted to know about this stuff. I
Mhm.
said, well, and I had actually I'm a writer by profession, and I had ghostwritten two other memoirs prior to this
Ah.
for to make money,
Mhm.
and so and they were very nice people, and I was ashamed that I was with my grandson who is a wonderful kid, and I couldn't tell him anything, and I didn't know anything, and I knew more about these two other people who were essentially they weren't part of my family. They were people I had
Mhm.
known
Mhm.
who asked me to write their memoirs.
Mhm.
And so I knew much more about their lives than I
Mhm.
knew about my own.
Mhm.
And that at that point stopped making any sense at all.
So then you had to write the book.
I had to write the book. I
Yeah.
and the book I was never meant initially to be for anyone other than my immediate family, which was
Mhm.
basically my sister, her kids, their kids,
Mhm.
uh, and my two sons, their families,
Mhm.
and that's all. And it was only at the very late stages, having put together a manuscript, that I sent it to a friend just to sort of show her, who was an editor.
Mhm.
And she said, she said, I read this, I cried, I laughed, whatever it is. And I think people need to read this. And
Mhm.
it's not
Mhm.
just your family that needs to read this.
Yeah.
And somehow I found a publisher. She suggested, this friend of mine, the editor, suggested a few things to do to add to the book.
Mhm.
And then we were off to the races.
Wow. So I was thinking it might be beneficial, your book might be beneficial to people who have trauma of other kinds, but who are children of people who are survivors in one way or another.
Yeah, in one talk that I talked at a library about the book,
Mhm.
and a woman came up to me, and she was clearly not an American, and then she said, I was born in Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
and I'm Puerto Rican, and this talk meant a lot to me because it reminded me, because she said she was a child parent. Her parents were in bad shape psychologically, and
Mhm.
she had to take care of them. And she was proud of how she took care of them and how her brothers took care of them and of each other.
Mhm.
And she wanted a copy of the book because she wanted to send it to her brother, because it touched her deeply that
Mhm.
other people could have similar experiences who in very different ways. And
Right.
so I think
Yeah.
for people can connect to a lot of it. Half the book is about my parents before I knew them,
Mhm. Mhm.
and the other half of the book is about my parents and my sister and me
Mhm.
after we knew them. So
Mhm.
the first part was the research,
Mhm.
and the second part was just memory.
Right. What you experienced. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking there are so many people who are suffering from war right now who eventually might write or read your book and
Hmm.
benefit
Yeah,
from it.
I hope so, because it does it tells you that the scars remain, but it also tells
Mhm.
you that
Mhm.
you can overcome a lot.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
but in a sense, you do need to understand what happened.
Mm.
And the more you can understand about what happened to the people that you were affected and that you love, the better for you, at least, and for
Mm-hmm.
probably your family, if
Mm-hmm.
not, because usually the people who are affected, for the most part, are gone or are very old or whatever. And you
Right.
really can't help them.
Right. So I want to know what your take on this is. Is it better to stuff the feelings and not deal with them, or is it better to face what happened to you no matter how traumatic it was?
I think I guess it's the level of trauma. I mean,
Mm,
I think there are some traumas that you need to repress
mhm,
at a certain level. I mean, maybe not all of it,
mhm,
but
mhm,
but it's either too painful or it just mars the life you have now.
mhm, mhm,
And maybe sometimes maybe it's better not to know everything. You
mhm.
know,
Not to
it's
remember everything.
yeah. I mean, because and that I think my parents made up stories. They
Mhm,
made up stories about their past because the truth about their past was too difficult for them to live with. I
mhm.
mean, my father, the 20 minutes that he talked to me, he told me about the last time he saw his wife and his two children alive.
Yes.
And 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 he was a religious guy. He was a very nice man. Never spoke of the past, right? He
Mhm,
really actively did not want to. And
mhm.
so I told him he had to tell me something because I was I it was likely that I was going to be drafted during the Vietnam War,
Oh, right.
and I had learned that I could maybe get out of it and not go to Vietnam
Mhm.
if I appeared before my draft board with a story that was compelling enough to them.
Right.
And so I figured, well, Holocaust survivors, maybe that's a story.
Mhm, mhm,
So I told my father, you have to tell me something because I may have to go to war,
mhm,
and
mhm.
that wouldn't be good
And that
for
would be
you.
even worse.
Yeah. So he told me this story about the time that he and his wife and children, and there were two little girls, a 4-year old and 1.5-year old,
Oh.
uh, and that they were hiding because
Mm,
the Germans had told them to come with one piece of luggage to the
mhm,
town square, and the rest of the story.
mhm,
And they didn't even know what was going to happen to them, but they were concerned, so they were going to
mhm,
go and hide.
mhm, mhm,
And that was his story. And they hid. He went out to get some food, to look for food, steal food.
mhm.
And when he came back, his wife and children were gone. And then he was taken by the Germans, and that was the end of it. And then he went to concentration camps, and at on a death march of all places, on the death march at the end, toward the end of the war, he was in a concentration camp in Germany, and a guy came up to him who he sort of knew from his hometown in Poland,
Oh.
who told him that he saw his wife and two little girls at Auschwitz, at the train ramp where they
Ah.
were doing the selections, whether you go to the left or to the right, to the gas chambers
Mhm,
or to the slave labor camps,
mhm.
and that they had taken my uh, my father's wife's daughters away, and so their mother ran out and said, "No, I'm going wherever they're going."
Mhm,
And so they all were killed. And so
mhm.
my father learns this on the death march on the way to Bergen-Belsen. And that's his story. That's what he tells me.
Mhm.
And he said, so now I knew. And then it's another sad part. He had been carrying a sweater that his wife wore, and it was on
Mm,
the floor where they were hidden. And he
mhm,
said he left that sweater on some in the farm where they were resting on the way to Bergen-Belsen, which was probably the worst of of the death camps. In any case, so that was his story. It took 20 minutes, and that's what he told me.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know the names of these kids or his wife's name. I didn't know where any of this happened. And I didn't ask him anymore. And that
Mm-hmm.
was it.
Mm-hmm.
It turned out that that couldn't have happened that way. Indeed, his wife and children were killed. They were killed. And I was pretty certain of exactly what day that they were murdered in Auschwitz through my research. But he, on that day and several months before, was already in a concentration camp in Germany, 300 miles away.
Oh.
So he could not have been with them, hiding out with them
Oh.
to try to save them.
Right.
And it took me some time to process that and then to say, so what's that all about? And I came to understand that he was so filled with guilt and with shame that he didn't do anything, and that he had survived when they had not. So this whole survivor's guilt is a real thing.
Yeah.
And he survived, and the people he was supposed to protect died instead.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't like a choice, but he didn't make any of these choices. But
Right.
so he made up another story. So he made up a story where at least actively they were trying to get away, and that he didn't know what had happened to them for most of the war, and for all he knew, they could have still been alive. And in fact, he didn't know for most of the war. He tried to find his wife after the war, hoping that somehow, and instead he found my mother. But I don't know if that was good or bad actually for either of them. But yeah, so he had done that. My mother had a whole other series of stories that she told us about her life before she met my father, before the war, and that was totally made up, because her life was a life of fantasy, and that was not that. Her life was her life of poverty. That was her life. Her real life was she had married a guy who made luggage in Poland, and they barely managed to eke out a living. She spent, before the ghettos and the concentration camps, she took in people's wash to make a little money so they could eat. But in the story she told us, which we believed fully, that her husband had a dance studio, and that she and her husband made lots of money in the dance studio in Krakow. And they had a maid, they had a 5-room apartment, and it was only when the Germans came and took everything away did her life collapse. But she had a good life, a life that was not as filled with poverty as our lives growing up. We were very poor. And she was very angry at my father for being so poor and for not being ambitious enough to get a better job or whatever it was. And they would fight about it all the time. And it was only when I was doing my research, and so my sister and I believed all of this, and then it gave us an excuse for understanding that my mother was angry at my father because he wasn't he worked as a clerk in a warehouse, and he didn't want to do anything else. He just wanted to have a family and be safe. So he never made much money at all. We lived in a crappy place, but it was okay. We didn't know any better. It was fine. But for my mother, we thought, well, she once had a different life. So of course she's angry at my father. Of course she wants him to have done better. And, maybe she wasn't so wrong or so crazy. But in fact, she was quite crazy. And in fact, they never had a dance studio. They lived in a hovel next door to her parents in a tenement in Krakow, and the tenement exists, and I was there, and it actually was the setting for Schindler's List,
Oh.
the building that my mother grew up in.
Oh, wow.
and the building that my mother lived with her first husband. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a tourist attraction for people who come and visit Krakow because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of children of survivors or relatives of survivors
Mm-hmm.
of Auschwitz, and Auschwitz is only a few miles away from Krakow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so they come and they do, and Oscar Schindler, so Schindler's List, Steven
Mm-hmm.
Spielberg's film, was filmed in and around Krakow and at
Mm-hmm.
Auschwitz. And so he used my mother's tenement as the setting for the Krakow ghetto. So
Ah,
all the scenes were filmed there. So
yeah.
it's become a tourist attraction. And when I went back to Poland or went to Poland to
Mm-hmm.
discover more about all
Mm-hmm.
the places my parents had lived that I had addresses for, I was as surprised as anybody to come to look at I basically looked up the address that we were
Mm.
going to visit, and the address was a whole story about Steven Spielberg and Schindler's List and all this other stuff. And when we got to the building, there were tour groups going through the building,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and they so it was another manifestation of growing up in an unreal world where my parents couldn't accept the lives they had.
Mm-hmm.
I think my father accepted it. He just didn't want to go back to even
Right.
thinking about it. And
Right.
my mother, for whatever reason, wanted to talk. She needed to, I guess, talk about the camps.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew the name Mengele before I knew almost any other name. I knew the
Oh.
name Amon Get, who was
Mm-hmm.
the commander of the Plaszow concentration camp, which
Mm-hmm.
is where many of the Jews of Krakow were sent. And he was a horror. And the story in Schindler's List was really my mother's story, except she was never saved.
Right.
So, but she went through all those stages. She went into the Krakow ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
She survived that. She went into Plaszow. She survived this guy Get, and Get, who was played by Ralph Fiennes in
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
and is so again. I knew the name Amon Get before I knew anybody else's name. I knew the name Joseph Mengele before I knew anybody. I knew the words Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen
Mm-hmm.
when I was 3 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So actually going to see Schindler's List was quite an experience.
Oh,
I
wow,
didn't
I
want to see
guess.
it. I didn't want to go at all. And
Oh,
I didn't,
yeah.
I didn't, I didn't know anything. All I knew was that it's about the concentration camps, and I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to go and look at a concentration camp. I don't want to have
Mm-hmm.
anything to do with this story.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Uh, and so my wife and our kids said, "Yeah, we'll go." It's in our past because they knew my parents had been in concentration camps. Uh, so we'll go. And when I saw it, which was in 1993, I guess, which
Mm-hmm.
it's been 30 years since the film came out, uh, it suddenly rang a bell. All these people that I
Ah.
had heard, all the settings, I didn't know that the setting that I was looking at of the Krakow ghetto was where my
Mm-hmm.
mother grew up. I didn't know that
Yeah.
till 25 years later. But
Wow.
but it rang a bell, and it made me feel at least I know a little bit more. I said, this is what my mother has been talking
Mm-hmm.
about.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand yet why she would tell us any of this,
Right.
and what
Right.
effect it had on her, really,
Wow.
besides knowing that she clearly was a messed up person.
Yes.
And I didn't know that her stories were not real. And
Right.
many of her stories, sadly, were real. The
Yes.
stories that she told us about the camps turned out to be all too real.
Wow. So I was going to say Schindler's List is a really difficult movie for me to watch. And I don't have any history, with ancestors being in concentration camps or anything like that. So how How was it watching it for you?
Yeah, I again, I learned. I learned. I didn't realize how much I was internalizing, but I learned over the years that we were listening to my mother's stories, and
Oh.
uh, that to distance myself from a lot of this.
Mm.
I
Mm.
think that was my survival. I think my sister, unfortunately, went the other direction and started to identify more than distance.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so in a sense, I was it made me feel that at least my that more a better like I had a better understanding of what my mother might have gone through at some level. So
Mm-hmm.
it was actually it was a good thing for me to have done
Mm-hmm.
it. And the only and so that was the only time that I sort of opened up the door to any of that. And then the only other time I did it was a few weeks after my mother died. My father had died 5 years previously, he had Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
And then my mother died in 98. So it was 5 years after I saw Schindler's List. And it was then that I decided I wanted to know not so much about them, I wanted to know about me. So
Ah.
I had a Swedish uh, birth certificate.
Mm-hmm.
And I had naturalization papers. I'm a naturalized citizen of
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
United States. Uh, and those were the only two papers that I had. And I didn't know anything about what was it about Sweden? Why were we in Sweden? I didn't even know why I was born in Sweden. Uh, I knew something that it had to do with my parents, obviously being in Sweden, and they met there. But
Mm-hmm.
why did they meet in Sweden?
Mm-hmm.
They never told me. I never asked. I mean, it was sort of the don't tell, don't ask policy of our
Right.
lives.
Yeah.
Uh, so, I decide to find out about Sweden, specifically only Sweden. So it's 1998, and email had just begun, but it wasn't a big thing then. But I was working, and I sent an email to Halmstad City Hall, Halmstad, Sweden. That was
Mm-hmm.
it. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know anything more. And I said, "Dear sirs," uh, and I made a copy of my birth certificate. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
"I have the Swedish birth certificate. Can you tell me more about why I have this,
Right. Yeah.
besides that I was born in Sweden?" So I get an email back from a newspaper person, a reporter who
Oh.
works for the newspaper in that town in Halmstad. And
Mm.
he says, "This is very interesting. I think I'd like to try to write a story about you." Because I had said to in my email, I said, "If you can tell me more, I'd like to come with my family and see where I was born."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So he said, "Well, if I can write your story about you coming to Halmstad, to this, it wasn't a tiny town; it's a small city
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
in on the western coast of Sweden." He said, "If you, I will then try to do research to find out more about where you lived in this town and why you were here."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So I said, "Sure." So we gathered, the four of us, our two kids who were teenagers, and my wife, and we flew to Sweden. And he met us in Halmstad, and he had a girlfriend or something, and he started to show us where, which address we had lived in and this and that. But the thing that was most startling about it was that he said, "I even found a guy that your father worked for, and
Oh.
maybe he could tell us more."
Oh.
So I meet this older guy, and he says, "Yeah, I sort of remember him as a very sweet guy, but he had, and was a hard worker, but he didn't really want to be here. And he was one of the survivors. He was one of the concentration camp survivors, a number of them. resettled here for a while.
Oh, yeah.
But he said, there's only one left. Maybe I'll call her and see if she's willing to talk to you.
Oh.
So I said, sure, yeah. So he calls. She says, so he says, if she can get her son to come to her house, she said, we can go and talk to her. So we troop there. We have a photographer from the newspaper. We have the reporter. We have my wife, my children, and this guy, who it was a shoe factory, I think. And we troop over, and this little lady opens the door, and she speaks. She doesn't speak English. She speaks Swedish. She speaks Polish, and she speaks Yiddish. So I say, and her son comes. So I tell her son, who speaks a little English, and I say, well, if you can have her speak in Yiddish, that's okay, because I can understand Yiddish. And since you speak, but I don't speak it. So I'll tell you, and then you'll tell her in either Polish, Swedish, or Yiddish, whichever way you want it. So we go through this little thing, and it was sweet, but she clearly didn't remember much. So then I start describing my mother and my father to her in greater detail, and then like a light comes on, and she says, "Wait, wait, wait." And she goes upstairs. She comes down with a little old leather purse. She opens it up, and she has pictures. And who does she have pictures of but me and my sister and my parents? They're taken there. And she says, now I remember them. I remember them. So then she told me what I already knew, which was that my mother was crazy,
Right.
that my father was a really nice guy,
Yeah.
and the dynamic was weird, and that she kept trying to feed us too much. My sister was a little too fat, and all this other stuff. And and then we all cried for a while, and the guy wrote his story, and so it was another little. But what did I find out? I found out sort of what I knew. I knew now that they had met here, that they lived here, that my mother hadn't changed in some ways for all these years, and and this was the town that we had grown up in. Then, when the book came out, I actually got in touch with this reporter again, who no longer works for the newspaper. He's a big sports reporter in Sweden, though. So I said, you know what I want to do? I want to do another story. Let's do a story now about your book, and let's do a story about what happened since the time you came to Sweden. And we did, and this was this 2-page big story in the Halmstad paper, now written by him again, with a different take on a lot of stuff, because now we knew a lot more. So it was sort of heartwarming, and a very nice man. But anyway, that's a long way of trying to answer your question.
Really, yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, because no, I think it's interesting, especially for those people who have some sort of trauma in their lives, and it could be really horrible trauma, like your parents suffered, and then you suffered as well, kind of adjacent, if you want to call it that.
Secondhand trauma, I guess.
Yeah. But I mean, it's all trauma, and we have to, sometimes you're right. I think maybe that whatever happens, the person just can't go back there, can't face it. They have to survive in another way by, like your mother, making up stories or constantly telling you about the concentration camps, which is a way of going, but it just seems like she didn't really deal with what happened.
No. Yeah. And the other thing, unfortunately, that she did to my sister is that she didn't allow my sister to grow up to be who she wanted to be. Uh,
Oh.
my mother had a fantasy life
Uh-huh.
where she was this popular, beautiful, social butterfly,
Mm-hmm.
with this dance studio that never existed and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And my sister was going to be a beautiful social butterfly. And she was not going to be a studious, smart, but fairly not social
Mm-hmm.
person,
Mm-hmm.
not that interested in getting dressed up and not that interested in boys, and just
Mm-hmm.
just she wanted to study. She was an excellent student, and she was wonderful with languages and all kinds of other stuff. And my mother wouldn't let any of that happen, or would try to avoid. So my sister had to go to parties. She had to join things. She had
Oh.
to get dressed up. She couldn't. She wasn't allowed to read much. Because then she would have to wear glasses, and if she wore glasses, a boy wouldn't like her, and all this kind of crazy, crazy stuff. But my
Mm-hmm.
sister, being a kid, took it to heart. Said, "Okay, I
Mm-hmm.
want my mother to love me. I want whatever it was,"
Mm-hmm.
and it took her years to become the person she wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sort of almost sort of toward the end, because my sister actually was taking care of my parents
Oh.
when they got old, and they were living down in Mobile,
Uh-huh.
and 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 it was only sort of around the time my mother was clearly near the end, and then afterwards that my sister was no longer what my mother wanted to be, which was a school teacher, which my sister hated it. Uh, and she went back and got a second master's, and she became a speech pathologist, and she loved it. And she retired basically just about a year ago or something.
Oh,
Uh, but
wow.
but this was what she wanted to do. She wanted to
Mm-hmm.
help people. She wanted to be smart and do interesting things and good things, and not be a kindergarten teacher. So anyway, so it
Yeah.
is, I think it's a very complicated kind of traumas and kind of influences. I mean, all of our parents influence us,
Right.
and there are good things and there are bad things about
Right.
not only parents but as people in your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it takes a long time to process that and then do something about it. And
Right.
the more you know, I think even if you don't accept it or even if you don't act on it, I think at a certain point, it has to be up to you if you want to know more and if you
Mm-hmm.
want to act on it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the fact that my mother had died gave my sister a kind of freedom
Mm-hmm. Gave her
uh,
permission.
to be who she always was sort of hiding away from
Mm-hmm.
being. So it was good for her. She got a lot of stuff from my mother that probably wasn't so good, but
Mm-hmm.
we all did. And but she, she's the same lovely person she always was, and the same intelligent person she always was.
Mm-hmm.
She just has all this other stuff that was just so ingrained. And I
Mm-hmm.
think also she was nursed by my mother when my mother's uh, hormones and her cortisol levels and all kinds of stuff that affects how you behave and
Mm-hmm.
how you deal with stress
Mm-hmm.
had changed so much abnormally because she was starved. And because
Mm.
she was starved, your cortisol levels, actually there's a chapter in the book about just the effect of this kind of trauma on Holocaust survivors and their children. That your cortisol levels, the flight and fright response that we have, what's supposed to happen is you get stressed by something that's going to hurt you,
Mm-hmm.
and your body and your adrenaline and everything starts going,
Mm-hmm.
and then when that goes away, so the levels go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
For my sister and for me, that's not the case. For my
Mm,
sister and me, the levels stay high. It's very hard to go back to normal.
mm,
And our circulating levels of cortisol are different.
mm,
So we don't deal with stress well at all.
mm.
And it was because her DNA changed in order for her to survive in the
Right.
camps.
Yes.
And that DNA came to us.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Through the breast milk.
Right. Well, and also, I cannot remember who it is. It might be Bruce Lipton, who is I think he's a physician, who said that, your mother's experiences while you're in utero
Right. Affects.
affect you.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's not just DNA,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. It's this whole epigenetic thing. But
yeah.
everything changes, or not everything, but lots of things change
Mhm.
because of who the person is who's carrying you.
Yes.
And so, yeah, we got stuff that she couldn't
Yeah.
help it. I mean,
Right. Right.
it's
Yeah.
not. We never, in all the years, except when we were very, very young, and we told her we hated her because she was just outrageous at a certain point. But
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, we never blamed her. I mean, we always felt bad for her. I mean, she
Right.
was,
Mm-hmm.
she wasn't like, she was off. She was weird. People stayed away from us, stayed
Mm-hmm.
away from her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, but we knew that she had gone through
This horrible
things
thing.
that no one should go through.
Yeah, because she was
And
telling you about the camps.
yeah, she was telling us about the starvation. She was telling us about, standing next
Oh.
to somebody who gets shot, and you don't even understand why, because Amon Get used to stand on a balcony and
Oh,
randomly shoot
right.
prisoners.
Oh, right. That's in
So
the movie.
yeah, well,
Oh,
that's in her head. That was in her
oh,
life.
oh
She
my
was
God.
standing there, and the woman she's talking to has a bullet in her head.
Oh, man.
And you don't even know where it came from.
Oh,
And this was like a daily life,
oh.
for a bunch of months, certainly until she went to Auschwitz, which was no picnic. And then
Mm-hmm,
you go
mm-hmm.
from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, where that's where Anne Frank and her sister died.
Right.
And they were in the same camp at the same time,
Oh, wow.
in Bergen-Belsen, because they all had typhus, and Anne
Oh,
Frank and her sister died of typhus
oh,
in Bergen-Belsen, and my mother survived the typhus. And the
oh,
reason why she went to Sweden is because they put her on a stretcher and they put her on
oh,
these ships, and the Swedish Red Cross took a few thousand of the survivors who were very sick and
yeah.
put them in quarantine camps in Sweden.
And nursed them
And my
back
mother
to.
was one of those.
Oh, wow.
And her sister, because the people in Bergen-Belsen was torched by the British
Right. Yeah.
because of the typhus epidemic that was there.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So and poor Anne
Oh,
Frank and Margot succumbed to that.
oh,
Uh, you know. Anyway, so yeah, so all of that stuff came to be, and you just don't know how. It's a lesson for all of us on how things can turn out. And when you open the door and you start understanding stuff, it it makes you feel at least that why.
yes.
Like you can't change anything.
Right.
I mean, when I had my night sweats, my doctors said they thought I had a blood cancer
Mm-hmm,
because
mm-hmm,
then it didn't go away.
mm-hmm,
And it didn't go away for several years while I was working on the book. And I
mm-hmm,
actually said at one point to my doctor, I said, you think maybe it's just that I'm working on this book and
mm-hmm.
things are happening? She said, no, not like this, not like this. And so, you go through all these tests. Luckily, they didn't find anything because there was, at least at that point, nothing to find.
Yeah. It was
Uh,
it
yeah,
was the book.
it was
Yeah.
this, it was reliving. I
Oh,
even remember the dreams I had. They were all concentration camp dreams, all of
oh,
them.
oh, wow.
and mostly and I had looked at pictures because I needed to understand where my mother really was. And I even found the barracks that she was in
Oh.
Auschwitz, and there was a picture of that. And so, you can't escape it. She couldn't escape it, and I couldn't escape her escaping of this. So
Right. Yeah, right.
it's a
Oh,
generational thing. Yeah.
yes. Yeah,
But
really.
and I remember when we went uh, to on our research trip.
Hmm.
Before that, we actually went to Israel, and I met my one of my sons and our grandson and granddaughter there in Israel, and we went to Yad Vashem, which is like the sort of major Holocaust memorial site and the
Hmm.
major place where, except for the U.S. Holocaust Museum and a place in Germany, I think. There's all the whatever records exist,
Hmm.
they have them there,
Hmm.
and so my grandson really wanted to go and look, but I mean it's a very difficult place to walk through
Oh.
because you see all the pictures, you see recreations of whether it's the railroad cars that they stuffed people in and half of them died, whatever it is, you see a lot. But he really wanted to, and we had to get we had to get permission from not only his parents but the place itself, because he was, I guess, at 10 by then, to
Oh.
actually walk through. And so I was his guide. And I just made
Oh.
sure to walk through very quickly places that he shouldn't see. And it's, but these are very difficult places to go to. But it's only when you see this stuff, the real stuff, can you begin to appreciate just, how few would survive. How
Hmm.
anybody would survive is extraordinary,
Really?
and that no one could ever be the same again,
Right.
and
Yeah.
never. It's not possible. I mean, it's not possible when bad things happen to people, on an individual basis, but
Yes.
a bad thing happening to you for 3 years
I
or four
know.
years,
I
I don't
know.
know. It's
Really.
and I still don't understand how my father, who is, I mean, you understand there are some people who do it by, just sort of buddying up to somebody or,
Hmm.
doing or, the but I just couldn't see my father, he was like the sweetest person you can imagine. He was kind. We had no money, and anytime he could give any money to anybody on the street, he would.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
he was just a generous person, very religious, who just believed in goodness and in
Hmm.
God and in all this stuff, even after all this happens. And I
Hmm.
think he actually became much more religious afterwards.
Mm.
Because sometimes you say, how could you believe in a God who would allow this to happen? And I think my father understood this is not God's work. This is
Hmm.
man's work.
Humans.
Uh,
Yeah.
and it's like this happens. And
Yeah.
so, but it's hard. But when you go there, at least you can understand how hard it is. And
Hmm.
then you can understand the pain and the trauma that people
Hmm.
have. And then you start thinking about people who experience that not on a daily basis, but experience that even once in their lives. And you
Hmm. Hmm.
and the point that I try to make about the book is that, you meet these two people who are these strangers who you don't really care about, these two sort of people. And then over the course of the book, you start actually caring for them.
Hmm.
And the whole idea, I think, if anybody has a takeaway for the book, is not only what hate can do, but actually it's sort of what love can do,
Hmm.
and what empathy can do. And for people to be empathetic, to just look at another person and say, there's a story there. and that person isn't just a homeless person because that's a fun thing to do. You
Right.
know,
Yes.
I mean,
Right. Yeah.
it's unlikely that this person really wants this.
Right.
And you have to give them something, if nothing else, just, you give them your whatever love you can give or whatever acceptance you can give of somebody, even if you don't want to feed them or go near them or anything. But they're not your enemies. They're not horrible people. They're just people who bad things happen to.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and if you can get empathy out of people by meeting, I have a lot of friends who read the book, who heard me talk about my parents, but never really met my parents. Uh, and so they get to meet these people and understand where they came from and what they went through at some level, and the stories they told themselves about it, whether they're true or not. And and they actually, they actually care for these people, and
Oh,
that
yeah.
made me feel good because
Yes.
because their humanity was stripped from them. They were not, that the
Right.
Nazi goal was to make sure that people were treated as pieces,
Mm-hmm.
shtick, a shtuk, a piece of, you're not a person. They took away your name, they gave you a number, and you were called by your number, and you were not a human being anymore.
Yeah.
And that's the way even the SS people could deal with what they were doing,
Oh,
because
right.
they weren't dealing with people anymore.
Yes.
Joseph Mengele said everybody who came before me when he was doing his selections in Auschwitz said they were ghosts. They were already dead. All I did was sending them to where they were going to be buried.
Oh,
And
dear.
right, and
Well, I yesterday I was watching a documentary called Not Black Enough. And a lot of the people were talking about, the being the descendants of slaves really did basically the same thing you're talking about, because a lot of one of the people they talked to is Lewis Gates Jr., who has that show on PBS about finding your roots, it's called. and a lot of the people who are black and who are descendants of slaves, when they find the slave records, they have to kind of guess that maybe this person who is just listed as boy 16 years old, black, on the ownership roster, that
right.
and it's sort of the same thing. It's
Oh
gone.
yeah,
And they were talking about, their ancestors having to try to survive. And then that's been passed, some of those behaviors have been passed down and down and down,
oh yeah.
down. Yeah.
And yeah, with slaves, I'm sure it's a parallel thing, and certainly the way they were
Yeah.
treated. They were not
Oh,
they were property. So
yes.
they didn't have families. Families didn't count. They were
Right.
there to do things, even to make babies, so that because they needed more slaves.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, so once you and then the
Yeah.
people who work with them, the whole reason why they created gas chambers is
Right.
because the soldiers who were killing the Jews, who had serious psychological issues because they were shooting so many people.
Oh,
They were
oh,
upset,
oh, yeah.
right? Because they would follow their
Right.
I forgot the name, but the name of the actual group of soldiers
Yeah. Who would,
who would follow the other soldiers into battle, and
oh,
then
yeah.
they would be the ones who would kill the Jews or the gypsies or
Yeah.
whatever it was.
Or
Uh,
the gay people.
and so they decided they had to do something more
Different.
less personal. So
Oh,
they came up with this idea of have them go into showers, and then we'll
oh,
just inject the gas, and
yeah.
then we'll have the Jews take the bodies out.
Oh,
So
right.
there were the group of prisoners would be in charge of
Right.
taking the bodies out and stripping the bodies of gold or rings
Whatever.
or whatever it is. So it was this whole thing again of depersonalizing every
Yes.
aspect of it, so that
Oh,
and when they were killed, you were like it was a cow. It was
right.
but except you're not going to eat it.
Right. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the things we do to each other.
Yeah, it's amazing, and and I hope that that book and these kinds of books, while they're depressing, certainly a lot of
Mm-hmm.
levels,
Mm-hmm.
also are enlightening, and at least you once you understand that you can actually like this person. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
you've grown up without ever meeting a Jew or
Mm-hmm.
whatever,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or having a friend who's black, and
Mm-hmm.
you read about these, and they sound like people. They go
Mm-hmm.
through the same problems,
Mm-hmm.
except sometimes the losses are worse or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah.
Then you can start looking at them differently, looking
Yeah.
at other people
As
differently,
human beings.
and
As
maybe all the terrible things that happen in the world happen a little bit less.
yes,
You know?
exactly. I love that goal. I love that goal. Yeah,
Yeah,
for your book.
yeah.
Well, we only have about 8 minutes. Do you have
Oh,
anything else you want to say?
uh, oh, I think it's just important. I mean, what's going on in the world today. I mean, you
Mm,
just look at that, and you just keep saying, how can we keep making the same mistakes over and over again?
mm-hmm,
We
mm-hmm,
don't actually ever learn much
mm-hmm.
of anything. I mean, and that's sort of depressing, because you can train a dog, and a dog,
Mhm,
you know, will learn. And
mhm, mhm,
you feed them, and you're nice to them, and you walk them, and you look after them,
mhm,
and they're your friends for life. They'll,
mhm, mhm,
and we can't seem to deal with people
mhm,
the same way. We can't just sort of say, there's always something more that we want from them or expect from them or
mhm,
insist on them, and we look for reasons why we're different, as opposed to reasons why we're the same or
mhm,
similar,
mhm,
and we fight over things that are worthless, because at the end of the
mhm,
day, we all die, we all want to be loved, we all
mhm.
and it I think people have to the more that, again, going back to this empathy thing, but people have to try to sort of see other people as though they, the old do unto others as you will have them do unto you. But that's
Exactly.
simple enough. But in a deeper way, in an ongoing way,
Mhm,
just if you don't want to be with somebody, then don't be with them. It's okay. You don't have to be friends with everybody. You don't have to love everybody, but you don't have to hate. Uh,
right.
and
Exactly.
particularly people you don't know,
Right.
who've never done
Exactly.
anything to you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
they have their own stories, they have their own problems, they have their own successes, and it just the Holocaust has taught us so much, except
Mhm,
that it hasn't taught us how to still love people more than hate people.
mhm.
I think that there's still maybe that's the way it is. That's the way we're created. That's the way we're born. Maybe that's what.
Or or
Uh,
maybe it's just little incremental
yeah,
learning to
yeah,
be empathetic. Maybe it's something
yeah.
that just happens a little bit at a time.
Yeah, and I think it also needs. I think you need to be conscious of it in a sense. I think
Mhm.
there is a certain awareness and
Mhm.
self-awareness that's
Mhm.
important to
Mhm.
change a behavior. You can't
Yes.
just sort of say, well, just be nice to that person because what they never did anything to you and this and that.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
you have to sort of personalize it in
Mhm.
a certain way, and you have to say, aha, now I sort of get it. I think you have to
Yes.
come to a realization, because without that enforcement inside your brain, it may not stay for very long. It'll just
Right.
be, and then it
Exactly.
won't be.
Right, exactly.
But the publisher of Painful Joy is a Dutch woman,
Uh-huh.
and she started the imprint uh, because she just decided that there wasn't in Holland there weren't enough people who were paying attention to
Mm-hmm.
the fact that there was a Holocaust, and if, in Holland actually, while it wasn't a particularly anti-Semitic place or this or that at
Mm-hmm.
all,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, more the percentage of Jews who were killed, who were Dutch Jews, is higher than I think in any other country except for probably Poland.
Whoa.
I mean, it was a smaller population, but a greater percentage of that smaller
Right.
population were sent to
Oh
Auschwitz.
dear. Oh dear.
Uh, and it's hard to understand. We went to Anne Frank's house a few weeks ago, actually,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, because we had seen some movie and we were going to Europe, and I wanted to see our publisher who lives in
Mm-hmm.
outside of Amsterdam in Leiden, and and when our publisher decided that she was going to change what she was doing to only Holocaust books.
Mm-hmm.
So and the reason was that she said that it's just people just don't understand, and that the only way you can understand it is by telling a story.
Right.
Yeah, the statistics tell you nothing.
Yes.
Everybody just says, "Isn't that horrible?" and this and that,
Yes.
and then you read the story of Anne Frank. Oh, I said, "Oh, now I sort of get it a little bit."
Yeah. Yeah, you have to
And
get the emotions.
yeah, so she's done, I think, about 100 Holocaust books,
Oh, wow.
and they're all they're either by the survivors themselves
Mm-hmm.
or by and it's called Amsterdam Publishing,
Mm-hmm.
or by uh, children or relatives of
Mm-hmm.
survivors,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or in some cases, and in she's done. I met. There was a gathering of some of her authors at the Just Consulate last year,
Mm-hmm.
and I met this girl. I think she was about 16,
Mm-hmm.
and she had written a children's book, a young adult book,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that was the story of her grandmother and
Oh,
what happened to her
wow.
grandmother. And so she
Wow.
wrote this book, and it was just wonderful to see this young woman, because usually you go to these places and you see people like me, or even a lot older than that,
Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
if that's possible. And yet, you see this young woman who is just so filled with life and filled with love and emotion, and just caring enough to say, "I have to tell my 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 grandmother's story." And the reason why she had to tell her grandmother's story, I found out, was that her father, because her mother was there with her.
Uh-huh.
And then she says, "No, I don't know if I asked about her father or she just volunteered. Her father had died, I think, a year or two ago,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a year or two before, of cancer."
Mm-hmm.
And and what her mother said is that she misses her father so much because he would tell her all these stories
Oh,
about
wow.
his family. And she decided when she was older, when she was 16 or 15, when she wrote the book, that she would have to tell, she'd want those stories to be told. And she
Wow.
wanted to gather them when she could.
So, this 16-year-old girl was telling you that she wanted to write the book because of her father dying of cancer and she missed him, or?
Uh, she 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 realized when he was gone
Ah.
that he had more stories to tell, and
Ah.
she wished that he had been around, or
Right.
that she had found a way to get those stories from him, because
Ah.
now they're gone,
Right.
and forever. And so she had a grandmother who had stories because she was a survivor in one way or
Mm-hmm.
another,
Mm-hmm.
and she wanted to make sure that not only that she got the story from her grandmother, but that she could be able to tell it to other people.
So, did she
And
do
so
research?
she wrote a
Huh?
young adult book,
Oh, that's cool.
about it, and it's published, and it was the first sort of young adult uh,
Ah.
Holocaust book that I know of.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
but again, my publisher, Amsterdam publisher, published it, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't, and it's just again the way I have learned all of this works is if you can tell an individual story, then you can get people to pay attention.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's
Yes.
just it's a bunch of numbers. It's a name of a country. It's the
Right.
there's nothing there. You
Yeah.
have to make people feel something,
Right.
and the
Exactly.
only way you can do that is by telling a story that
Mm-hmm.
makes people
Mm-hmm.
identify with a human being.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, this was an event that the publisher had with all of, or open to all the people that she had.
Yeah, so all the authors,
Yeah.
all of her authors who were in the U.S. or were around,
Oh.
and uh, and we're doing it again next year, and she's trying to make it more of a thing,
Uh-huh.
because
Uh-huh.
I think she wants she likes the authors to talk to each other and this and that. Everybody has their
Mm-hmm.
own little stories, or and
Mm-hmm.
then that's so that you know, well, how do you publicize, or how do you do this or that? But I
Right.
think in general, uh, people just people like the idea that that they're part of something,
Right.
and even being part of a bunch of people who are telling very sad stories about
Yeah.
very sad things that happen makes them stronger and makes them feel that
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason why you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you have a reason besides that, you want to make a little money, because it's very little money,
Yeah.
uh, but if you're doing it so that people can learn something that is worth learning. I mean,
Yes.
if I hadn't gone to, and I don't expect people to go to Auschwitz or to go to lots of these places that we went to, because
Mm.
it's difficult, and it's difficult to take once you're there, but you need some reason to believe.
Yes.
And I think when my sister and I were growing up, we needed some reason to believe,
Mm-hmm.
because we were not in a great place,
Mm-hmm.
with
Mm-hmm.
people who were very damaged. Uh,
Yeah.
and so what did we do? We I think came to believe in family, and family became the most
Ah.
important thing in our lives. So
Mm-hmm.
we would do anything, and I think I would say that for her, and I would say that for myself, anything for our
Mm-hmm.
family, anything, and and because we saw what happens to a family that isn't all right,
Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
or that has lost that. I mean, I met all I have friends, and they all have families, and
Mhm.
didn't have a family. I mean, I
Right.
had these two people that I didn't really want to be around all that much,
Right.
because it
Yeah.
wasn't a fun experience.
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
so I think the idea of I think at the end of my presentations, for all the I just show a picture of my family, of
Mm-hmm.
our extended family, of the
Mm-hmm.
kids, of the
Mm-hmm.
grandkids. And that's the legacy that my parents left us.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's what they left the world, because their first families were gone.
Right.
They, instead, it's a picture of 23 people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, my mother alone had, at one point, 13 children in her family,
Whoa.
13 brothers and
Siblings.
sisters,
Mm-hmm.
siblings.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out, in those days, a lot of kids died young, and this and that.
Right.
So she ended up with 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but she had, her family was extremely large.
Mm-hmm.
These families were these poor Jewish families were gigantic,
Mm-hmm.
and yet there was almost nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
family becomes your way of connecting to the past, and it's
Mm-hmm.
your way of projecting the future.
Yes.
uh, And I think if there's anything about talking about the Holocaust, it's always talking about it, because when I talk about my mother's first family and then the second family and all this other stuff. And you start thinking of all the people that were involved, that
Right.
and what would have been like to have a family of 20 or 30 or
Right.
40
Right.
instead of four. It was only
Yes.
there was the four of us. That was it,
That's,
you know.
yeah. Uh-huh.
That wasn't enough. And it's not like we had a lot of kids. Maybe we would have had more I don't know why, but we had twins, so we thought that was enough. Twins was enough. We didn't have to go any
Yeah.
further. We
Yeah.
thought one or two. Well, it came out two. But
Yes.
I think all of these kinds of issues and ideas come through these large, grand stories, sad stories about the Holocaust,
Yes.
happy stories in that they survived, sad stories is that only a few survived.
Right. Yeah.
And then you start asking how they survived and what they survived and what did they do to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I never wanted to know what they did, how they did, because I'm sure they did things that were debased humanity at some level.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, my mother would always talk about scrounging in the dirt for like insects and stuff to
Mm-hmm.
try to get anything into her body that she could
Mm-hmm.
eat. So you don't want to know that, but you want to know why they wanted to continue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's when I talk about painful joy, I talk about that for all the evil around them, they found a version of the good. For
Mm-hmm.
all the hopelessness around them, they found hope.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to find what's good about the survival, not
Mm-hmm.
what the reason you shouldn't or couldn't have survived. It's the reason why you continue to survive. And then if you
Mm-hmm.
can take those attributes and you make them a little more important in your own life,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's better for your kids, for your future, for your friends.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it adds something to the world.
Wow. Yes. Oh man, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so happy that we got together again.
Yes.
So,
I talk too much. I apologize.
oh no, you don't have to apologize. I thought it was all fascinating.
Mm.
So, I'm probably not going to edit very much of it out because everything that you said is so relevant for what's happening today.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. We need to figure out how to have more empathy and to see other human beings as human beings instead of
Yeah.
the other or, the
Yeah.
enemy.
And the more mechanical the wars are and the more
Mhm.
distant it is, the more difficult it is to
Mhm.
even begin to understand
Yes, really.
what that
Yeah.
means. I don't
Yeah.
know. Anyway,
Yeah. Well,
enough.
thank you so much for being my guest.
No, thank you for having me. It's always it's a treat for me. I just I never thought I would actually talk very much about any of this.
Mhm.
Not that I ever thought I would even know any of this. Uh, but the thing that I know is that if I spent another 5 years, I'd probably know more. But
Mhm.
I'd rather just spend the 5 years talking about what I know and then just trying to enjoy it than
Mhm.
looking for more to talk about.
Yes, and spreading the word.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, and we'll be in touch, and you'll let me know how things are going.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a rating and or review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. I invite you to join my Patreon community at patreon.com/storypower, all one word. Or if you like, you can subscribe to Story Power on Apple Podcasts. It's my aim to build a community where we discuss the stories we love and talk about what we learned from them. I offer extra audio content and story suggestions to my patrons on both platforms. Remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Let's spread the story love. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.